Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. This is your host Weeb Union, and we go straight to the west of Bakhmut, where the Russians have managed to break through the Ukrainian fortifications here to the east of Chasiv and gain control over the first portion of it. With this, the remaining Ukrainian fortifications in the area amount to a few separate defensive positions across the east of Chasiv. The Ukrainians have numerous fortifications and trenches by the first lines here to the east of Chasiv. The Russians will attempt to push through these fortifications bit by bit, where they will develop their offensive operations towards Chasiv, capturing the eastern parts to the east of the canal area, where fighting will take place in the forest area and the fortifications east of the canal line. The Ukrainians so far are seeming to be defending for every single square meter of ground. As such, we will be seeing a lot of bloody battles taking place as the Ukrainians will stand for every single fortification and not fall back. This tactic is a very costly one for the Ukrainians because they are at a significant firepower disadvantage. Fighting over areas with few fortifications do not make any sense. The only areas where it makes a bit of sense is, for example, to the west of Avdiivka, where they claim that the fortifications behind the first line and second lines of defense are not well enough prepared yet. So moving the fighting to these back lines would be just giving Russia more land with no extra benefits. So they are trying to hold the front as long as possible until they build the next lines of fortifications properly to gain the advantages needed from it. But even with just the geographical advantages, falling back has an advantage. The Ukrainians are relying too much on the fortifications to hold back the lines, when in the end what really matters is the elite troops that are now being lost fighting in undefended areas. The Ukrainians are wasting some of their best troops ahead of a Russian offensive, defending frontline positions that aren't even fortified. The current situation in the Russo-Ukrainian war has not been as clear as it is right now. The Russian army, since the start of the invasion during this period of over 2 years, have significantly improved and strengthened their offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities. The Russian army on day one of this invasion is far from what the army is today. The Russian army is now much bigger, better trained, experienced than it was on day one. The Russian army today is completely incomparable to the day one Russian army. The Russian army on day one made several mistakes that were beyond just being unprepared and miscalculating the force of the Ukrainians to an army that could not really fight a serious war. But that has changed today. Many people, including my own viewers, completely underestimate the capabilities of the Russian army. We all made the mistake once of completely overestimating it, but we should not make the mistakes of the past cloud our judgments for today. We see that the Ukrainian army has also significantly changed since day one. The day one capabilities of the Ukrainian army was to do guerrilla tactics, hit the supply lines of the Russian army, and take advantage of its mistakes. The Ukrainian army of today can stand its ground against this new, more trained, well-developed Russian army. They have made proper use of their fortifications, they have significantly developed their FPV and drone capabilities. The Ukrainian army has significantly developed as well throughout these years. However, Ukraine as a country is in a much worse position today than it was 2 years ago. The economy is in the gutter and getting worse day by day. The demographics have completely crashed, with the country losing about half of its population. The war has been in a year, suffering intense damage from Russian missile strikes and long-range strikes and frontline battles for 2 years. The country of Ukraine has become one of the poorest countries in the world and is suffering immensely from the war. The Ukrainian country's capabilities to continue waging a war, even with Western support, diminishes as every day goes by. Meanwhile, the Russian country is now richer, more combat capable, The industry has completely and significantly improved to the point that the Russians now produce approximately 3 million shells a year compared to less than a million prior to the invasion. So the Russian industrial capacity and the economy in Russia is able to survive prolonging this war and sustaining the war at the current level it is at. And at the same time, there's room to increase the efforts that the Russians are putting into this war. In the meantime, support to Ukraine from the United States has been stalled for half a year. The EU is also half-assing its support for Ukraine, with the Ukrainians suffering from severe lack of ammunition, most notably artillery shells, to the point at which Western commentators are talking about the fall of Kiev, while the front line has not moved for over a year. And by the front line not moving, we say that in the first few weeks of the offensive, there was a much larger significant territorial change than what happened in the next months. And after that, we saw the Ukrainian counterattacks had regained territories. But since then, there has been no major movements across the front. But that is something that is about to change. Battle of attrition is a battle where both sides grind down their opponent's capabilities to the point of collapse. However, the Russians have an interest not just to collapse the Ukrainian army, but also other things that can only be achieved by the Russian army marching through major cities such as Kharkiv, Odessa, and Kiev. The Russians are looking to gain control over areas that they believe are theirs, while at the same time toppling the Ukrainian regime and replacing it with another. It is becoming increasingly evident that these are things that the Russian army of today is capable of doing. Pretty much anyone who follows this war notices that today the Ukrainian army is struggling. They're struggling at the front. The Ukrainian government is struggling. The legitimacy of the Ukrainian government ends in May with no elections taking place. All of these things all add up to multiple factors that has an effect on the Ukrainian society. Ukrainians that I talked with used to talk about how they were going to win the war. Now they talk about whether or not they should escape to European countries or to Russia, or where to go to avoid what is about to come. The front line is going to move in Ukraine, and it's going to move a lot to a point we haven't seen since the start of the war. And this time, there will be no withdrawal from Kiev. There will be no significant changes. The Ukrainians have gotten all the aid package they're going to get. They may get more in the future, but at this rate, they haven't even received what they have been promised from the old packages. There's no significant mobilization taking place, because they're already doing everything they can to just fill in the gaps at the front line. Nothing that Ukraine can do can turn the situation around. There's no turning point in Ukraine's hands right now. The only question for Ukraine is for how long they can survive. I'm not going to claim 3 days to Kiev or all of this dumb stuff that people just make up on the spot. No one knows how long something takes. You can only make estimates and guesses. What I can tell you is that the Russians have no hurry to launch this offensive. The longer that Ukraine suffers in the current suffering that it is undergoing, the more difficult it is for the soldiers at the front line to be fighting. The more difficult it is for them to hold on to their fortifications and ammunition. However, a protracted war carries a huge risk, and therefore it is more likely that the Russians would launch this offensive sooner rather than later, even if they have an interest in delaying it. Based on all of this, we can see that the situation currently is 100% completely under Russia's initiative, and it will likely turn into a massive offensive, and that is definitely going to happen as the Russians have an interest and the capabilities of doing so. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon.